Thank you for coming to the Bibb Tobacco Flue, a Southern Maryland experiment. And our guest speaker tonight will be Dr. Jim Gibb.
Two brief announcements. The Archaeological Society of Maryland plans its annual field session at a site near Denton that's on the eastern shore of Maryland. It's going to be an Aboriginal site, fairly rich one. It begins May 19th and runs to May 28th. So there's 10, 11 days in there, including 2 weekends. It's bracketed by weekends. So if you're interested, it's a good time. The other announcement is Friday night at 7 o'clock. I'm giving a talk at the Hartford Community College, and it's part of the 250th celebration of Hartford County, and also touches on the 250th anniversary of our country. And it's going to be a hybrid meeting, so if you don't want to drive up to Bel Air, you can get a link, a Zoom link. And so if you're interested, just email me. I think everybody has my email, who's on so far, and I will send you the link. Okay. Other than that, I guess I'm ready to go. This is work that I helped out on that we did at on the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum in Calvert County back in 1989, if memory serves. So I'm digging deep here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Maryland tobacco culture, just to give you some background, and then about flue curing of tobacco, by which I mean curing tobacco using a technique, a methodology that's different from the widespread use of just air drying. And I'll go into some of those details. And then I'm going to talk about the Bibb Tobacco Flue, a patented device that we excavated and recovered, and which is now at the MAC lab, the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab. Talk about its design, and it was patented by a local guy in Calvert County. Talk a little bit about who used these things and where. They're very rare. It's a technology that didn't catch on, and that is why what I'm going to wind up here with is, why didn't the tobacco farmers of Southern Maryland adopt this technique of producing high quality cured tobacco? So a little bit about tobacco first. It used to be, we could just say a few words about this, and everybody around here knew about growing tobacco. But with the great tobacco buyout by the state of Maryland, there's virtually no tobacco growing in Southern Maryland these days. There's some Amish farmers that do it. I mean, here and there you'll see a field of tobacco, but it's become pretty rare. When I first got to Maryland in the late 80s, driving down the road, I guess it would be in the spring, when the tobacco crop had been cured and was being delivered to auction houses, there'd be tobacco leaves blowing, little bits of them blowing all over the highways as truck after truck would go past with these sort of open baskets of dried tobacco. And so you could just see it's almost like a little snowstorm of tobacco all over the place. Haven't seen that in 30 years. So in terms of planting, tobacco is what we call a 13-month crop. That is, it's about 13 months between planting it and actually selling it. So first of all, of course, you plow the field, you harrow it. But what tobacco farmers would do is they have like a large garden where they would plant the tobacco seeds. Tobacco seeds are very small, and the best way to plant them is to mix them up in some sort of medium, even if it's just soil. Plant them in this large garden affair, wait till they pop up a couple of inches, then dig them up and transplant them to the actual fields. The tobacco, basically it's a big weed. It grows with big, broad leaves. And so during a good part of the summer, the major effort that goes into it is weeding, and removing pests, particularly these large tobacco worms, which are like tomato worms. They're really big, fat, ugly things, and you pick them off and you just sort of squeeze them between your fingers to kill them. And then farmers typically would top off the flowers. I have a picture showing you what the flowers look like. The idea being removing the flowers would encourage the leaves to grow bigger and larger. Whether or not any of this is true, I don't know. I'm not an agriculturalist, but this is what folks would do. And then the tobacco would eventually die and dry, turn brown out in the field, much like field corn. And folks would come along, cut the stem down near the ground, and just sort of lay these plants out in the field for a day or so to let them wilt. And then they pick them up and hang them up in tobacco barns to be cured over the winter. And once they were cured, the leaves would be stripped free of the veins, and they would be, prized or put in these large baskets and then shipped. And I see on my list, I have that inverted, should be prizing and then shipping. And if you ever go into a really old tobacco barn or into some museums, you'll see a large screw-activated press that's on the ground, and they would use that press to squeeze the tobacco leaves into large hogsheads or barrels. And that's traditionally how it was shipped. Early 20th century, especially with automobiles and trucks available, they'd use these large square baskets and just lay out the hands, the leaves of tobacco in those baskets to transport it to wherever they were selling it. So here's a tobacco field. Again, you don't see very many of these in the area today. Of course, we still grow lots of tobacco down in North Carolina, Southern Virginia. Tobacco is also grown in Connecticut and various other places. But different kinds of tobacco were grown. Some tobacco is really good for making cigar wrappers. Bright leaf tobacco down in North Carolina and Southern Virginia is good for cigarettes. Orinoco tobacco, which is what we grew mostly in Maryland, was used mostly as a filler. Its primary advantage was that it burned really well. It stayed lit. And so it would be mixed with bright leaf, for instance, to make cigarettes. And you can see the little trumpet flowers on the tops of these. Historically, these would be pinched off or cut off to encourage more growth of the leaves. And those are pretty big leaves. They would go into barns, and it might be a little difficult to see, but those of you who have been around these know what I'm pointing to anyway. There's these little pieces of wood that you could see on the barn if you follow my mouse. These are just little pieces of wood on a screw that would turn, and that would lock the siding into place. If you turn them vertically, then in this case, you could lift the boards. They'd be hinged at the top, just under the eaves of the barn, and they would hinge outward. You prop it open, and that would let air in. The other kind would be hinged so these things opened horizontally. But the main idea with these tobacco barns is that they're not weather tight. The roof better be weather tight. You don't want rain coming in. But the siding itself would have gaps in it, or would be hinged, louvered, so you can let, when the air is dry, you can let it waft through the barn, and that would dry the tobacco. The leaves would be speared on these tobacco spears, which are about 3 foot long, maybe. Never actually measured them. They're just riven stakes. And they would be hung up in the rafters. The tobacco barn with these kinds of rafters, and basically the general way they're built, they're not really good for adaptive reuse. They're really good for curing tobacco and not much else. As a result, most tobacco barns have been destroyed over the years. A few years back, the National Trust for Historic Preservation had them on the list of the 10 most endangered kinds of cultural resources. And the problem really is that even if they're standing in their pretty good shape, it's really hard to find another use for them. They're designed in such a way as they're just not suitable for most other purposes, not without significant alteration. So here's a photograph. A lot of these photographs I've stolen from one person or another, and I apologize for not listing the source. I haven't listed this source here, but they're not mine. But you can see the tobacco leaf hanging upside down in the barn. The siding is open, so there's lots of nice dry air that gets through, dries the tobacco. After which it's pulled down and usually sometimes there's a stripping shed within the barn. More often than not, there's a little lean-to addition to the building where the tobacco leaf is brought in and the leaf is stripped away from the stems. And those stripping sheds usually have like a little parlor stove, partly because this is done January, February when it's kind of cold and damp. And that, basically, that's where workers would strip the tobacco leaf. And they typically do it on relatively humid days because that just made it easier to strip without ruining the leaf. Let's see. There we go. Tobacco barns come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. Well, I mean, they're typically rectangular, although they might have all kinds of additions. And this is another one of those images. I don't know where I stole it from, but this is a really small one. And actually another photo, I have a couple of photographs I could have used of buildings like stables for horses or mules that were designed in such a way as they could be used to handle overflow tobacco crop. So they might have been used primarily as a stable, but portions of them could be used to also hang tobacco. But that's a small tobacco barn. You wouldn't get very much in it. Here's more typical, what you'll see out in the field. You could see right through it, the slatting. And there's this addition here. I don't recall exactly what this was used for, whether there was a stripping shed in here or not. This is the tobacco barn that the University of Delaware recorded some years ago in Port Tobacco, owned by Frank Wade. And so they've done this nice elevation drawings, as well as, I think we have a floor plan for it too. Yeah. So this is basically what we do with these tobacco barns. More often than not, there's no way of preserving them. More often than not, they're in just awful condition. So trying to rehabilitate them is a pretty overwhelming job, an expensive one. And so what we do are these nice measured drawings, so at least we capture what the barn looked like, how big it was, and of course where it was located. At the University of Delaware, they collect all kinds of drawings out in the field from throughout the region. This is just a sample of the kinds of tobacco barns. There's a lot of variability here. However, I think these are all louvered tobacco barns. They're all based on air curing of tobacco. Finding flue-cured tobacco barns is more of a challenge. We'll talk a little bit about flue curing. This is a relatively recent drawing of how these things work. This is the floor plan of it. And basically you push heated air through into the barn, let that heated air circulate. It's dry heated air as a rule. And that cures the tobacco more quickly and more uniformly. So once you've got that tobacco barn full leaf, it's going to cure it. Pretty much everything's going to cure at the same rate, which isn't necessarily true for air curing. And also, at times they could add moisture if they don't want it to get too dry. What do you suppose is one of the major problems with introducing heated air into a tobacco barn? Tobacco's principal job is to burn. And if you've ever been in a tobacco barn where the tobacco is still hanging up, it's cured, or has recently been removed, you'll notice there's a lot of dust in the air, a lot of tobacco leaf dust. It is highly combustible. It doesn't take much to burn down a tobacco barn. So having any kind of heat source and any kind of open flame near a tobacco barn is a risky deal. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but just to point out that it's not just a matter of introducing a certain level of heat for a certain period of time, turning off the heat, and then stripping the tobacco. It has to be, the barn has to be warmed slowly, kept at a certain temperature for a while, and then raised more, kept at a certain temperature, and eventually maybe moisture is added as well. So it actually takes a little bit of skill to flue cure tobacco. Air drying tobacco, so far as I know, and I'm not a tobacco farmer, hanging it up, I mean, you need to hang it up in such a way as you get as much as you can in without sticking, squishing it together so it doesn't air dry properly. It seems to me air drying requires a lot less skill. So the subject of tonight is the Bibb Tobacco Flue. And the Bibb Tobacco Flue is named for the manufacturing company, the Bibb Furnace Company in Baltimore. They were a company that manufactured stoves principally for household use. And I think they had a manufacturing facility up in Port Deposit, if memory serves. But the design that we're talking about was developed by George W. Dorsey, who lived in Calvert County, was a big-time farmer, tobacco among other things. Bentley Bibb, who actually owned the furnace company, and George Needham, whom I've not researched yet. I'm not quite sure what his role in this is. But these guys were co-patentees. Let's see. And let me just read this to you. This is from the patent application, which you can download. You can download patents from the U.S. Patent Office. To all of whom it may concern, be it known that we, Bentley C. Bibb and George F. Needham of the City and County of Baltimore and State of Maryland, and George W. Dorsey of Port Republic in the County of Calvert, that's around Prince Frederick, have invented a new and useful arrangement of apparatus for curing tobacco, and we do hereby declare that the following is a full, clear, and exact description of the same, reference being had to the accompanying drawings forming a part of this specification. And here's where they say, okay, the specific things that make this unique, that make it, that warrant its patent, or the nature of our invention consists in the combination and arrangement of a furnace, hot air jacket with or without evaporating pan on its top, heating pipes, direct draft pipe, and hot air distributing pipe for the purpose of curing tobacco in a barn or other building. So here's the drawing. So here we have on the far left-hand side the actual furnace, which is usually wood-fired. I don't think anybody was using coal in these things. I think it was strictly firewood. And you see this large metal jacket that covered it. And then between the furnace and the jacket is what's called the chamber. You see these pipes coming out to a central drum and then an exhaust flue. And the idea is you would have all that heat in the furnace, and through natural exhaust, it would go through these pipes and out the flue. While traveling through those pipes, it was distributing heat, dry heat, throughout the barn. So you have the furnace on one end, you have the drum on the other, the pipes connecting them, and the movement, the draft of that heat going through the pipes to the other side is what cured the tobacco. And on top of both the drum and the furnace, you have these pans where you could add water, and that would introduce some humidity if the operator thought that was appropriate. So this is from the original patent drawings. From the foregoing description and inspection of figure 1 of the drawings, it will be seen that the furnace occupies one end, that is one end of the barn, the drum the other, the heating pipes the sides, and the distributing pipes the center of the drawing room, and therefore perfect heating of the room at all points is effected. So that's it. A fairly simple design, simple concepts. Actually, as we'll see when I talk about the one example we have of at least the furnace still being in place, it wasn't as simple as that. There are some tweaks that were necessary to make this work. So here's just another view of how the system would work. Again, we have the furnace at one end, drum at the other, and it's foreshortened because this would be for a 24 by 48 foot barn. So almost 50-foot barn. That means these horizontal pipes are going to be a lot longer than the illustration would suggest. And you'll notice some are horizontal and some rise up. Those are labeled H. For bigger barns, you can have two setups where you have a furnace at each end and a drum in the middle, or a furnace in the middle, I should say, and drums at each end. Or you can have a whole bunch of these things. So the bigger your barn, the more additional parts you add, but it's still basically the same thing. A furnace to produce heat, and these pipes to distribute that heat evenly throughout the barn. Notice all these are shown as a simple horizontal device. I hate this phrase, but they use it. It is believed, presumably by the patentees, that our mode of preparing, curing, and dampening tobacco by artificial heat and by steam or vapor will prove a valuable benefit to the tobacco grower and the public, as time will be saved and lost by being crowded and the crop prevented, and the quality of the tobacco greatly improved. So that's the idea behind the patent. In practice, people found that this is kind of a tricky system to use, and it required more skill, more knowledge than air drying. Not sure if I had a figure in here or not. If I did, it disappeared. Oh, I see. This is just the caption for the last ones. So this refers to the plans I just showed you. You know, for bigger barns, you need a more elaborate device, which also means more money. I stole this off the internet. It's just a postcard, but from the Bibb Stove Company, Light Street in Baltimore. That's where their offices were. That's not where they actually manufactured them. But here you can see that they made heating stoves, cook stoves, gas, oil, and gasoline stoves, hollow air, and this is dated 1895. So that's the range of things they produced. They did produce catalogs. I've not actually been able to view one of those catalogs yet. I would love to be able to do that because in the catalog we might find the tobacco flue advertised, and we get a better sense of what it cost and possibly what configurations they offered. We have one report that one of those furnaces cost $250. In postbellum Maryland, $250 was a lot of money. So these things were not cheap. If that was, I think, as I recall, I was a European visitor who provided that datum. And so there's possibility of something being misunderstood. So we don't really know how much they cost yet. Another image I stole off the internet, you can see the BC, Bentley C, Bibb Stove Company. So this is their storefront here. They even have some wares, it looks like, in the window. Oh, I know, this is from a newspaper, the files from a newspaper, the Dispatch. And also from the internet, from Amazon or whoever sells this stuff, a medal, presumably used to advertise their wares. And this thing's about maybe an inch in diameter. But the BC Bibb Stove Company, Baltimore, Maryland, established 1851. Fireplaces, fireplace heaters, cook stoves, ranges, furnaces, etc. So this is just, you know, one of those things floating around the internet you can bid on. So that brings us to the Perrin Barn in Port Republic. Again, not far from Prince Frederick, a little bit south of Prince Frederick. And this is the Perrin Barn. Not in great shape at the time. I imagine it's gone now. And over here on the far right-hand side, this is Patricia McGuire, who worked for Julie King at the Southern Maryland Regional Archaeology Center at Jefferson Patterson Park back in the late 1980s. And I was just a volunteer on this project, helping her. There was no money available for this, so the find was reported, and Julie had Trish and some of us volunteers go out and work on it. So she's excavated, she's documenting the excavation around the furnace, but this is the furnace here. And you can see at least one stovepipe would come out. I don't have a whole bunch of photographs from this. I assume they have a good selection over at the Mech Lab. But basically, we recorded this thing. We did some excavation. We recorded it. And I wasn't part of the removal team. It was removed to the Mech Lab where it was conserved, I understand. But I haven't seen it since 1989, so I don't know. And this is a drawing produced. You could see a brick foundation on which that furnace sat inside a larger kind of like a little cellar hole with a stone foundation around it. The foundation for the furnace itself was 5 foot by 3 foot. The larger pit was 12 feet by 7 feet, and it was 1.5 foot deep, as I recall. We know from title search that the barn was the property of either James A. Bond or his son, John T. Bond, in the late 19th century. So one of those two guys had this thing installed. They were prominent in the county. They're fairly wealthy, large farmers, as was Dorsey. And just another view of what this thing would have looked like in practice. This drawing, none of the drawings show the furnace set into the kind of hole that we found. So to go back, this is a fairly elaborate thing, hole dug, a little foundation built, and then a smaller foundation within it to support the furnace. None of that shows up in any of the drawings. None of it shows up in the letters patent. This is something that one of the Bonds did to accommodate this thing. And I suspect what they were trying to do was lower the furnace, because you got the tobacco crop above and you want all that room to hang tobacco. So you lower the furnace into the ground. Also, by lowering the furnace, especially if the drum is kept on the surface, all of these pipes would have to be elevated somewhat. And that really helps with the draft. That's what keeps that hot air moving through. So I suspect those two things had something to do with why we have this big hole in the ground in a tobacco barn. Lower the furnace to make more room for tobacco and to facilitate the flow of hot air. So, how common are these things? Well, I think the answer is not very. Calvert County, they did a survey of existing tobacco barns. It must be 20 plus years ago now. And there are very few examples of barns that might even have been flue-curing barns. One of the problems with finding these barns, these flue-curing barns, is that flue-curing didn't pan out. It didn't last very long. Now, what do? You remove the furnace, make room. Okay, makes sense. But what do you do about the barn? Do you knock it down? And this is a weatherproof barn because you want to keep that heat in. And you're switching to air drying, that means you have to re-side the barn with the louvered siding. And that means the barns that survive today, even if they were for flue curing, have been modified. So it's very difficult to tell whether or not they were originally flue curing or had always been air cure barns. So let me see. I guess on the next image I have which barn this is. This might be a Dorsey barn. But you can see there's and this is pretty common with tobacco barns. You can see there's an original core structure. And in this case, there were wings built on each side, presumably to increase storage for larger tobacco crops. And then there's sort of this shed addition that kind of fills it in. Next image, yeah, there we go. Yes, this is another parent barn. But you can see this central area is the original barn with a drive-through, so you can actually drive your wagon in, unload the tobacco by lifting it up to guys who are hanging up there in the joist, hang that tobacco, and then you can continue the wagon out without having to turn it around in the barn. And then there are these large wings that were eventually added, and I have a note here that there was a tobacco prize in this room here. Again, that's this horizontal screw type thing that packs the tobacco into a wooden hogshead or barrel. And you can see there's a series of posts that run across, wooden posts. This is that area that's been filled in. It's probably for to shelter animals, not tobacco. So that's another parent barn. And this is a Dorsey gray barn. Again, you can see there's the original structure and then these lean-to additions on each side, partly for storing tobacco, for curing tobacco. Presumably there's a stripping shed inside of one of these, and storage. And here's a view of that barn. So we've got the two original parts, shed additions on each side. What makes this a possible candidate, and I'm not sure what made the previous one a possible candidate, but with this one, it had board and batten siding. That is, the siding was vertical, and a strip or batten is nailed over where the two boards come together. And that would make the barn weatherproof. And if it's got weatherproof siding, that means it was almost certainly used for flue curing because you couldn't get the air in there to dry the tobacco. And finally, I think this is finally, as far as the examples go, this is the Simpkin Coatback barn in Charles County. Dentsville, I think, is the nearest central place there. This barn was just south of Route 6 and just west, if memory serves, of Trinity Church Road. But it's well ventilated now, but it had louvered siding to allow the air in to cure the tobacco. But inside the barn, and it's funny because we were out there, we were going to do some archaeology one day. It was raining pretty hard. So several of us, Esther Reed, who's running the project, her boss, Kathy Thompson, and me, and maybe Elsie was there too, I don't recall. There were several of us, and they were just sort of getting in the barn to stay out of the rain. And I look over to one side, and there's this hole in the ground, the floor of the barn. It's like, well, what's that doing there? And we don't know for sure. Here it is. But this very well could be for housing one of those Bibb tobacco furnaces. It's roughly the same size and depth, And it's hard to explain why else somebody would put a hole in the bottom of their tobacco barn, because these are earthen floors and you're hanging tobacco, you're climbing up in the rafters, you've got people handing this stuff upwards. You don't want any holes in your floor to fall in. It's been, someone has suggested that, well, it was a place to hide, bootleg whiskey or something during Prohibition. And, if you're going to hide illegal goods, hiding it in your tobacco barn is probably not the best thing to do. Go out in the woods nearby so you at least have plausible deniability. And also, these are earthen floors. I mean, how do you have a hole in the floor and cover it up? I mean, it just the flue curing seems to be the most likely scenario for what this thing, why this hole was in this barn. But again, if you look at the siding, it's all louvered siding now. Well, that's because flue curing did not catch on, and rather than knock down the whole barn, you simply replace the siding with something that was louvered. And some of these, sometimes the siding is the spacing between the vertical boards is so wide, they don't even need to be hinged. I mean, just even in this case, you can see air, you can see light through the siding. That's how they were supposed to work. So, why didn't it catch on? And I've looked at this, and I've been thinking about this sort of thing for years. First of all, there are high startup costs. If the furnace actually costs $250, we're talking about a time when your average unskilled labor made $1 a day. So $250 is 250 days of work. That's expensive. The second cost was the barn. The typical louvered barns wouldn't work. You have to have this thing well sided to keep the weather out and to keep the dry heat in. And so you either built a barn for the purpose, or you might have adapted an existing barn, but still you would need to reside the entire thing. That's pretty expensive. That's a lot of wood. It's a lot of nails. And finally, what little reading I've done on this, it seems that the whole process is trickier than just air drawing. It required that you raise the heat in certain increments for a certain amount of time. And that meant you had to basically keep an eye on it for, somebody had to be managing this thing probably for several days at a time. And for all that, it doesn't look like they cured tobacco any faster. I mean, you have to harvest your tobacco at a particular time. You have to get it under a roof. The flue curing doesn't seem to have helped that issue at all. You still would have had to get the rest of your crop into one barn or another. And you needed people who knew how to operate it. The second major issue was the ability to manage risk of failure. If you're a farmer, big farmer, and let's say you're raising typically, let's say 15 to 30,000 pounds of tobacco. If using this system, you screw up, maybe you've got a furnace, you've got an open flame inside of a tobacco barn. Never a good idea, right? If that barn goes up in flames, you lose the barn and you lose, a couple thousand pounds of tobacco. If you're a big wealthy farmer, you can afford that risk. And your crop is only going to be 2,000 or 3,000 pounds. If it all goes up in flames in your barn, or if there's a problem, you didn't conduct the process correctly, and you ruin that crop, you're in big trouble. I mean, that's your cash for the year gone. Plus, you almost certainly borrowed money on that crop before it went to sale. So smaller, poorer farmers simply couldn't afford the risk. And then finally, and this occurred to me more recently, if you go to an auction house, when they existed, they were all over the place. Here, up in Marlboro had them, Hughesville. The people who are going there, the wholesale buyers, generally are going to that tobacco auction house to buy a particular kind of tobacco. So I suspect that those who are buying tobacco in Southern Maryland were not looking for bright leaf tobacco. There are other people who bought that kind of tobacco further south, North Carolina, Southern Virginia. So even if you produced a couple of thousand, maybe even 10,000 pounds of flue-cured tobacco, did you want flue-cured Orinoco tobacco, which is valued mostly because it burned well? Were you growing some bright leaf tobacco? If so, was there any distributor who was interested in purchasing bright leaf tobacco in this particular market? Were they able to, were the wholesale buyers able to handle small quantities of something that was atypical of what they were really trying to buy? So I think these are major variables that precluded most Southern Maryland tobacco farmers from raising tobacco, from flue curing tobacco. And so they stuck with the traditional method. It was fairly inexpensive. They'd been doing it for generations, so they knew how to do it. The market system was there to buy it. Risk was fairly minimal. The biggest risk for a lot of these farmers probably was fluctuating wholesale prices for tobacco. That, and of course, the bane of every farmer, unpredictable weather. This study, let me see if I have any more. No, that's it. This study is kind of interesting because it addresses not just flue curing of tobacco, it addresses entrepreneurship and innovation in agriculture and other lines of business too. Who are the innovators? What prompts some people to try things in a new way or create new products, and what discourages most other people from doing so? Is it just a great idea? Or is it an idea that's current, but for most folks impractical because of the high risk involved and the high investment cost? And so we can take this kind of study and apply it to other things. For instance, blacksmithing, who's doing the latest and greatest in blacksmithing? Who's really learning their craft? And how many of these guys eventually go over to basically just purchasing manufactured parts and replacing them? We saw it in cheese making that I talked about in the last year or two around the Civil War. Who's buying up milk from a bunch of local farmers to kind of mass produce cheese? Who can do that? It requires capital. It requires taking big chances. If the cheese doesn't work out, the farmers, for them, it's not a problem because they're selling the milk. And if the cheesemaker screws up, that's the cheesemaker's problem. So this does allow us to start thinking about innovation in various sorts of trades, thinking about who does it, who can afford to do it, and how that then affects that particular industry. So anyway, that's about all I've got for this evening. Happy to take questions if you have them.
I don't know where the little hand is. May I ask a question, Jim?
Yes, you may ask a question.
Thank you. Do we know how many of these units were ever sold?
No, that's an interesting question. And I don't know if there's the Bibb firm, I think, survives, but they sell, water heaters and stuff or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a Bibb Stove Company archive. One of the neat things that our industrial archaeologists do is we find these companies that have been around for generations and we raid their archives. And it's amazing the stories you can put together. It's usually referred to as, public history. It's an aspect of public history where you write the history of a particular company, often for that company, they pay to have it done. But to sort through their archives and sort of answer some of these questions and generate new ones is really a fascinating thing to do.
Yeah.
The other thing we can do is look at the catalogs I don't know what years they published catalogs, but let's say, for instance, they did it every year or every 2 years or something like that. If you go through all their catalogs from the 1860s into the 1920s, say, if the furnace first shows up in the first few issues and then it kind of disappears, that's a pretty good clue that, you know, they weren't selling these things. The other possibility, of course, is that they were selling them, but they were selling them further south. People would place orders and they would ship them down to Raleigh or Durham or Greensboro or someplace like that.
Can I ask another question if no one else is ready?
You can ask them whether they're ready or not.
Well, thank you. It's kind of a question within a question within a question. It may change.
I'm already confused.
Well, I guess what I was thinking about was, I mean, this sounds pretty scary to me. You're putting an engine that produces heat into an environment where you have a highly inflammable object. And so I'm thinking in terms of insurance, or how many, do we have reports of these things burning down? You know, and that kind of gets to your ability to manage risk of failure. I can see where someone who's a kind of a basic level farmer might not want to get into this, but if it's a farm on the level where they actually have insurance.
Well, let me start with a brief anecdote first. I was living down in St. Mary's City at the time, and a friend and I were driving back from a theater in Washington, D.C. at night after the performance. And I think it was probably Route 5 we were driving down. And out in a field on this rise was a tobacco barn, completely engulfed with flames. It was a pretty spectacular sight. When tobacco barns go up, they go up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a whole bunch of old kindling there to begin with, whether or not there's leaks inside of it. The way flue curing, as I understand, is done today is the heat source is actually outside the barn. And so that makes a lot more sense. And that's a technology that was used at least since the 18th century. The huts at Valley Forge and other cantonments that George Washington had, they often had a heat source outside of the hut. So the semi-subterranean huts with this sort of little stove type affair in the ground stove, providing heat inside. In terms of insurance, yeah, it would be interesting to see if there were insurance records of, poor and average farmers probably weren't insuring their crops. That's a relatively new thing nowadays. But the bigger farmers, they may have been able to purchase some kind of insurance. But I don't know of any evidence of that at this point. Again, if you go to old insurance companies, those have been around for generations, they may have records that go back to the late 19th century.
And there's some of those in Baltimore.
There are. I know Steve Israel was doing some work. I think it was the Sanborn Insurance Map Company. He might have stumbled into something like that. I don't know.
Same people that did the Sanborn insurance maps.
Yeah. And I assume they were insuring folks too. They were also an insurance company.
Right.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, Jim, I got a couple of questions. One, I think I understand that in Simpson Kodak, the existence of that pit was what gave you the clue that you thought this might be flue cured.
Right.
But then there was definitely evidence that they went back to air curing because of the size of the barn, etc. Why in the heck didn't they just fill in this big hole in the middle of their barn if they're trying to get up and put stuff into the rafters?
Jim,
Oh, no.
Elsie, I have the answer, I think, for you.
Okay.
That pit was probably used to keep tobacco soft when you were stripping it. You would put the tobacco when it was soft, you would pull it down out of the barn when it was soft, tie it up in bundles, place it in the pit, cover it over with wet burlap sacks and a tarp. And then as you were stripping it, you would pull out one of these big bundles at a time and take it to your stripping spot and strip it. That's more than likely the use for that pit.
Was that typically done in most tobacco barns, or was that kind of an innovation?
Well, my father built a whole room to do that, but typically you would just put down canvases
Right.
and put the tobacco in when it was soft, cover it over with wet sacks and more tarps without building anything special. But that kind of pit would be very good for storing soft tobacco. So you could keep stripping it a longer period of time. You had to wait for a rainy day for the tobacco to get soft before you could take it out of the barn and tie it up so you could strip it. So you want to do as much as you could one day and then keep it soft for a week if you could.
Yeah, the challenge is, how do you test these competing hypotheses archaeologically? And that's the tough part. If we did a minute study of the barn frame, would we see evidence that it originally had board and batten, or some other kind of weather resistant siding? Maybe. Will we find parts of the this basically stovepipe around? That might suggest flue-curing, but then stovepipe was used for the houses as well, and derelict tobacco barns are popular places to throw trash. So I don't know.
The second part of my question was, does flue-cured tobacco require a different variety of tobacco than air cured, and would they have had to change the type of tobacco they were growing to do that?
Well, I don't pretend to be a specialist, but I see no reason why flue curing would require a different variety of tobacco. However, depending on how the tobacco is used, is it worth flue curing? If you're just flue curing, filler that burns well, I mean, does it really matter whether it's flue cured or air cured? With bright leaf tobacco, apparently it makes quite a bit of difference.
Well, I mean, like in the South where they do a lot of this heat curing stuff, it's a different variety than we used to use up here, isn't it?
Right, they're using bright leaf, a sweet tobacco. The leaf, I think, is lighter and more delicate. And they're looking to create a very uniform color and texture to those leaves. So for bright leaf, it's important. For Orinoco, probably not. So there was a lot of hype over this thing. In fact, W.W. Bowie from over in Prince George's County, a very prominent agriculturalist and politician too, I think, relative to one of our governors, Ogden Bowie. He wrote I think it was a series of 3 articles on the value of flue curing tobacco. And I wasn't able to find my copies, and I think it was in the Southern Agriculturalist or one of those journals from immediately after the Civil War. And he extolled the virtues of this, about how it produced uniform quality and yada, yada, yada. But, people hype stuff all the time. There's right now, there's one television station I listen to a fair amount, and they keep selling these fruit and vegetable supplements, Nature's something or other. And they take all these vegetables and squeeze them down into these little capsules. And so you don't need to have all your fruits and vegetables each day. Just take a couple of these. Apparently they have one for 5 or 2. And these things are selling, there are all kinds of doctors and whatnot pitching this stuff. And
Doctors.
yes, I mean, is it really any good? I mean, has anybody actually tested this, or is it just an expensive placebo? And it may be the same thing with the furnace, that maybe it wasn't such a good idea, at least for Southern Maryland tobacco farmers. Again,
Well, the other thing we saw from looking at the census, now this only applies to Anne Arundel, that the production of tobacco was going down from about 1860 or so. And the market in Maryland may have just dried up, and that may be another reason why you don't find them.
Well, I mean, did we continue growing tobacco like crazy up until the buyout in 1990, thereabouts? And a historian who worked at Patterson Park fairly briefly, it was new to the area, did a whole bunch of research. He came to the conclusion that folks around here grew tobacco just because that's pretty much what they did. They were used to it. It was habit. It was tradition.
Yeah.
He couldn't understand why folks continued to grow tobacco despite wildly fluctuating prices. It just didn't seem like a good idea to him. But then I think he was an urban boy. I think what these bigger farmers were trying to do was to increase the value of that which they produced, knowing that they were producing less of it. And typically the argument has been, well, after the Civil War, there's emancipation and the labor force begins to dry up on these guys. And tobacco is a very labor intensive crop for at least certain times of the year. During long spans of the summer, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot to do, the weeding and removing worms. And so it may be that they were trying to realize the same amount of money from a lower quantity of tobacco, but labor might have been an issue. But Ray, as you and I both know, there's serious problems with soil.
Mhm.
And the soils around here become incredibly depleted. They say exhausted, which means not just a loss of fertility, but actual loss of soil. It's washing away. And that may have become a real issue too, where less and less land is suitable for growing tobacco. And again, you look at the literature and people talk about how tobacco depletes the soils of nutrients. I can tell you categorically, tobacco does not deplete soils. Harvesting tobacco depletes soil nutrients. If you grow tobacco, let it grow and let it die and let it rot in the ground, you don't remove any nutrients.
Right.
So let's not blame the tobacco. It's our harvesting that tobacco that removes nutrients in the soil. And also growing tobacco, it doesn't cause the soil to erode. It's us planting the tobacco in these with lots of room around each plant that leaves a lot of soil exposed. And then from the 17th century onwards, you get people out there who are just seemingly habitually weeding, removing the weeds that actually not only keep in soil moisture, but also help hold the soil in. So the whole process seems to be destined for failure and soil destruction. But let's not blame it on the tobacco plant. Were there any other questions? Come on, Amy, I know you're full of questions. None of them have to do with today's subject though, right?
Well, if you one thing that did came to mind, I hope it's a quick one. The way that they affix the leaves to those spears, did someone actually take the time to shish kebab each individual leaf onto those spears?
Ned, I think this one's for you.
Had tobacco sticks. The spear went on the stick. You speared the stalk about 12 inches back from the end that was cut.
Okay, so not just the individual leaves.
No, you'd have
No, it's a
5 big
stalk.
plants per stick.
That makes more sense. Okay.
And when you see these derelict tobacco barns today, very often they have big piles of tobacco sticks in them. And when we find a derelict one, I often grab a bunch of those because I cut them up and use them for witness stakes around my steel spikes that I use for surveying. So pound 3 of them into the ground around a steel nail, put some flagging tape on it so it's easy to see them again. But again, like the tobacco barns themselves, what do you do with old tobacco spears? I mean, they're riven pieces of wood. They've often been used a lot. They've got this sort of polish on them from pushing them through the stalks. But they serve no other purpose other than maybe firewood.
Decorators use them.
Yeah, you can make a fence out of them.
Yeah, most of them really aren't good enough condition to make a fence. It'd be a very short fence too. They're only about 3 feet long. I mean, say about
4.5 feet.
4.5 feet. Okay.
That's more typical.
Yeah. I was just thinking, with my arm trying to figure out how long are these things typically. I mean, you could do craftsy things with them, but basically they're firewood. Any other questions? All right. Well, I think we're done for this evening. It's 8 o'clock.